welcome to the public defense of Dino Knudsen's PhD thesis, the Trilateral Commission, the Global Dawn of Elite Governance and Diplomacy, 1972 to 1982. And a special welcome to the two external members of the assessment committee, Professor Jussi Hanimäki from Geneva and Professor Giles Scott-Smith from Leiden. And the third member, the chairman of the committee, is Associate Professor Regin Schmidt from the Saxo department. And it's the Saxo department that the author has been affiliated to, and his supervisor is Professor Paul Vium. And my name is Carsten Due Nielsen. I'm the appointed moderator. And the moderator is responsible for the defense proceedings according to the rules. And as I look at it, the rules are these. The defense proceedings consist of 4 parts. First, the author makes a presentation of his thesis, and this must not exceed 45 minutes, and preferably around 30 minutes. And then Professor Scott-Smith has 30 minutes for his comments and questions, and that includes Dino Knudsen's response, if he has any. After that, we'll take a short break, and after the break, Professor Hanimäki has 30 minutes for his comments and questions, including the answers. And if anyone in the audience wants to intervene with questions or comments, there'll be a short time for that. And they should give me notice if they intend to make any interventions as soon as possible. And then finally, the chairman of the assessment committee, Professor Regin Schmidt, concludes the defense proceedings. And the chairman may prolong the discussion of the thesis, but he should at last cite the reasoning behind and the conclusions from the written preliminary assessment. And then finally, the assessment committee will convene shortly, and after that they will inform us about their recommendation to the faculty. That's the program for this afternoon. So we start with Dino Knudsen.
Thank you. Dear Assessment Committee, dear advisor, dear audience, thank you so much for being here today. The 1970s were a time of fundamental economic and political transformation that profoundly shaped the world we live in today. Both the economic and energy crisis of recent years thus not only resemble, but also have roots in the 1970s. The present changes in the international configuration of power, including the economic decline of the US and the emerging new economic centers, not least in former developing countries, were heralded by the 1970s. And this is also the case with respect to how politics changed some of its traditional forms. If any organization can be said to have symbolized and to a certain extent pioneered these changes, it was the Trilateral Commission. Today, I will present to you the results of my study of this organization. The work I've devoted myself to for the past 3.5 years. More specifically, I will give you a few facts about the Trilateral Commission, introduce the source material I have used in my dissertation, present my research questions, explain my results, introduce a new concept that I have created, and explain my main argument or result. But let me begin with a few facts. The Trilateral Commission was formed in 1973. It is still active today, but since my study is a historical one, I will talk about it in the past tense. It consisted of 3 sections: North America, Western Europe, and Japan. Its basic purposes was to develop mutual understanding and an extended collaboration between the 3 regions, including influencing opinion, governments, and international collaboration. Its main activities were its meetings, production of reports, and issuing of its magazine Trilateral. Meetings were conducted under the Chatham House rule, which reads like this. Quote, when a meeting is held under the Chatham House rule, participants are free to use the information received, but neither the identity nor the affiliation of the speaker, nor that of any other participant, may be revealed. The Commission had 180 members when it was inaugurated, and 320 members in 1983. Members were drawn mainly from politics, business, and academia. To illustrate the elite character of the organization, let us briefly take a look at some of the most prominent US members in the period I have investigated. And here I just want to explain to you that when you were a commissioner, you could not simultaneously hold a position in government. So these people have either been in the commission before or after they were in government. Presidents Jimmy Carter and George Bush Sr., Vice President Walter Mondale, Secretaries of State Henry Kissinger, Cyrus Vance, Alexander Haig, Warren Christopher, National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, Chairman of the Federal Reserve Paul Volcker and Alan Greenspan, World Bank Presidents Robert McNamara and Barbara Conable, bankers and corporate heads David Rockefeller from Chase Manhattan Bank and Paul Austin from Coca-Cola, among others, academics Joseph Nye, Robert Owen and Richard Gardner, among others. The Commission was essentially a US invention and a US-run enterprise in its first years of existence. Therefore, I've mainly studied the Commission in a US context. However, it has also been my ambition to capture the transnational dimension of the organization. The study covers the development of the Commission in its first decade, from 1972, when it was conceived, to 1982, when its third triennium ended and the fact that Reagan had become president changed the rules of the game. I have used a multi-archival approach that included state and private archives from the US and Europe, as well as archives of international organizations. I made an effort to include sources from the Commission itself, its donors, collaborators, and those that it sought to influence. However, since my study has focused on North America, it is based mainly on archives in the US, in particular the relevant collections in the Jimmy Carter Library and the Rockefeller Archive Center. In fact, in the spring of 2011, I became the first researcher to be granted access to these collections at the Rockefeller Archive Center. This access has provided me with a unique insight into the very engine room of informal policy and diplomacy making by the trilateral elites. My study of the Commission has had 3 immediate aims, or what you can call my minimum research agenda. Firstly, I'm quoting myself now, to trace the Commission's background, origins, purposes, characteristics, and modus operandi, unquote. In other words, what were the Trilateral Commission's background, origins, purposes, characteristics, and modus operandi? Secondly, quote, to investigate the elite aspect of the organization and how this related to democracy. In other words, how was the Trilateral Commission elite, and what was the implication of this for the Commission's relationship to democracy? Thirdly, to show the Commission's contribution to the development of ideas, diplomatic practices, and policymaking at national and international levels. In other words, how did the Trilateral Commission contribute to the development of ideas, diplomatic practices, and policymaking at national and international levels? These 3 questions served the overall purpose of the dissertation, or my main research question, if you will, which has been to evaluate, quote, the significance of the Trilateral Commission, how and why it mattered, particularly the implications of its activities for the way we understand policy formulation, the decision-making processes, and diplomacy in modern democratic societies, unquote. In other words, how and why did the Commission matter, in particular for how we understand policy formulation, decision-making processes, and diplomacy in modern democratic societies? My main research agenda has been to answer this question. As you may notice, a movement takes place in my research questions from the specific to the general level, from questions of a more factual nature to questions which cannot be answered based on immediate empirical observation only, but involves more abstract reasoning and interpretation. The same movement takes place in the dissertation as it progresses, and the structure of the various chapters constitutes a common argument, which I shall return to in the end. Now let me present some of my results to you. Chapter 1 deals with the origins, the formative phase, and the inauguration of the Trilateral Commission. I demonstrate that its founders thought that increased economic interdependency made extended collaboration necessary, and that the Commission was formed to avoid a scenario in which the industrial democratic centers of the world would drift apart towards crisis, conflict, and chaos. And more specifically, to counter the unilateralism of the Nixon administration. Although the Commission was a product of the work of a group of people, I argue that it was mainly the outcome of the ideas, initiatives, and activities of Zbigniew Brzezinski and David Rockefeller, whom I, with an analogy from the film industry, designate respectively the director and the producer of the Commission. In Chapter 2, Chapter 2 deals with the characteristics and uniqueness of the Trilateral Commission. Contrary to its transatlantic predecessor, the Bilderberg Conferences, the Commission was thought of as an action-oriented organization, not limited to dialogue and debate, but aimed at fostering consensus among its participants at various levels and impacting governments, public opinion, and international collaboration. Accordingly, the Commission combined close meetings of a fixed membership with open and public work. With its quasi-institutional name, the Trilateral Commission gave the impression, and this was intended, of being both close to and independent of government at the same time. In reality, however, the Commission was a hybrid organization positioned in the gray zone between the state and the civil society. Nevertheless, in the 10-year span that I have investigated, the Commission developed from the intended policy and action-oriented nature to becoming more of a forum-like organization, centered on dialogue, especially due to the pressure of the Japanese and European. Furthermore, I also demonstrate in this chapter how the Commission developed informal diplomacy, including how David Rockefeller acted as an informal diplomat or ambassador, a liaison between trilateral governments. And here I can just add that David Rockefeller had his own private jet, and when he toured the world, he was received by the highest authorities. It could be presidents, prime ministers, kings, wherever he went, and often they perceived him as a kind of ambassador for the US government, and sometimes he even conveyed messages from the government itself. So he was this kind of informal actor. Okay. In Chapter 3, I document how the Commission was led, and I argue that it was not a democratic organization in the more traditional sense of voluntary associations. Decisions and directions were top-down rather than bottom-up. The organization strove to form an internal consensus, and to achieve this, it avoided controversial issues like security. Moreover, it abstained from including persons who did not belong to mainstream politics. Thus, pronounced right-wingers and left-wingers did not take part. I document that financial support of the organization was weak in Europe and Japan initially, but due to suspicions about the organization being a tool of US hegemony. In this period, the support of its main financial backer, the Ford Foundation, was crucial. However, from 1976, the Commission enjoyed considerably political and financial support from governments in both Europe and Japan, and was also used by them as an important diplomatic venue. Chapter 4 explores the Commission's membership, its main source of strength. I argue that it was a very exclusive group from both a social, ethnic, and gender perspective, in which women and minorities were considerably underrepresented, as they did not constitute the power centers of the trilateral societies. The Commission was dominated by big capital in the form of representatives of some of the world's largest banks and corporations, whereas labor was not strongly represented. Furthermore, in a US context, I argue that the Commission represented a transition in the foreign policy elite, in which we witnessed the dissolution of the traditional foreign policy elite of the East Coast and the rise of new economic and power centers in the south, center, and west of the country. In this situation, the Commission functioned as an elite integrator and a catalyst for the formulation of a new foreign policy consensus. And the old foreign policy consensus, I can just add, was in dissolution because of the Vietnam War and because of the banning in general of the Cold War. So there was a need to form a new consensus, and the Trilateral definitely tried to do that. The new consensus involved establishing a firm alliance with Japan and Western Europe with the perspective of co-opting the Third World and the Eastern Bloc countries. I contend that the Commission served as a refuge, a retreat of the elite during the widespread demand for a democratization of the foreign policy decision-making process. In Chapter 5, I analyzed the Commission's main activities: the publishing of its magazine, trialogue, its meetings, and its production of reports. I argue that its meetings were important spaces for informal encounters and developing personal relations, confidence and trust between members and government officials. These meetings also served as a training ground for rising leaders. In synthesis, the meeting served as a diplomatic arena in which commissioners or decision makers could present policy initiatives, including receiving response or inputs, and build support for their ideas. Furthermore, my findings suggest that the Commission, through its meetings and issuing of reports, was successful in formulating and promoting recommendations that were adopted as policies by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Additionally, I argue that a tension between defending and questioning democracy was not only expressed in the Commission's notorious report, The Crisis of Democracy, and here I can just explain to you that this report was written, the chapter on the US was written by Samuel P. Huntington, who was later became famous for his thesis about the clash of civilizations. And in this report he argued that the US and the Western world in general suffered not from a deficit of democracy, but a surplus. There was too much democracy. Okay, this tension between defending and questioning democracy was embodied in the very nature of the Commission. Thus, the format of the Commission itself, with its exclusive elite membership and closed meetings, called into question some of the fundamental notions and ideals of democracy. In democracy, the people, not an elite, are supposed to rule. Democracy values openness and transparency, but the Commission operated behind the scenes. Democracy values an egalitarian spirit, but the Commission leadership held deep reservations about the masses. In Chapter 6, I showed that the Commission initially was met with both reluctance and support in different government quarters in Europe, and how it from time to time developed an almost symbiotic relationship with the Japanese government. However, my focus is the Commission's relationship with 4 consecutive US administrations. The administrations of Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, and Ronald Reagan. With respect to Carter, I argue that initially it was not the Commission that used Carter to gain influence, but the other way around. Carter used the Commission as a springboard to become US President. In the Commission, Carter got, among other things, his principal foreign policy education and important contacts in the US elite. When it comes to international collaboration, I showed that the Commission had a close working relationship with the World Bank, in particular Robert McNamara, who later joined the Commission. I have found indications that the Commission directly inspired or triggered the foundation of the G7 meetings and the G7 format. And certainly, the latter institutionalized some of the central tenets of the Commission, especially inclusion of Japan as an equal partner in international affairs, which constitutes the biggest achievement of the Commission. Overall, the Commission walked a tightrope between being close to and independent of government. In Chapter 7, I analyzed the impact of the Commission, including how it built an informal, partial, and temporary alliance with the US State Department during Kissinger's watch. Although it kept its independency, its work could be seen within the larger framework of a division of labor established by the department. I also discussed its influence on Carter's foreign policy, but principally I argue that we need to leave the conventional idea of one entity, in this case the Trilateral Commission, impacting another entity, that of formal government. In order to really make an advance in understanding the Commission and its significance for how we perceive modern politics and diplomacy, we need to adopt alternative ways of thinking about the issue. I'm now approaching my main result, but in order to do so, I need to introduce you to the conceptual framework within which I have been working. It is the merging of this framework and the empirical evidence which have made it possible to transcend a more ordinary analysis of the Commission and, I think, make a real contribution to this field. For decades, the informal, unofficial or private aspects of politics and diplomacy have been treated as unwanted stepchildren by the academia. International relations and diplomatic history focused on the interaction of states and left little room for other actors. International political economy focused on the market and transnational corporations. However, it is now becoming acknowledged that politics changed some of its traditional forms in the 1970s. In that decade, transnational organizations originating in civil society mushroomed and gained in significance. Yet, we historians still lack an accurate vocabulary to describe and analyze this phenomenon. In the present literature on the subject, the prevailing concept thus implies a sharp distinction between government and civil society, doing little to illuminate their intertwined nature. Non-governmental organization is the dominating concept in the present literature. However, there are problems related to this concept on both a definitional and practical level. The concept is defined negatively. In fact, it is a residual category. Its relationship to transnational corporations, political parties, or national liberation movements is not really clear. Moreover, the way the concept is applied frequently fails to encompass business organizations or religious groups. In synthesis, the concept implies no participation in governing, when what we historians need is a concept that does exactly the opposite. Other alternative concepts have been developed, but none of them really solve this problem. The really fundamental problem is that concepts such as state actor and non-state actor are no longer truly operational because the symbolic boundaries between the national and the international, the governmental and the non-governmental, between governing and being governed, the for-profit and the non-profit sector, the scientific and the activist, are constructs rather than facts, as the Trilateral Commission itself perfectly illustrates. Indeed, I contend that the Commission and other so-called non-governmental organizations are key regulatory actors in globalization on an equal footing with financial institutions or international organizations. How is it possible to conceptualize this phenomenon? Well, in order to do so, I have made use of the concept governance, which has received increasing recognition in the social science in the past decades, but has not been applied to my field of work in history. This concept addresses a shift from a focus on government to a focus on governance. In this approach, the policy process is characterized by, and I quote, an interplay between interactions in institutionalized and non-institutionalized settings among actors operating in multiple arenas. It focuses on both formal and informal interactions, on less hierarchical relationships between actors, on how interests, goals, and actions are coordinated, and how this influences particular policy outcomes. Governance implies that the decision-making power of public administrators of formal government diffuses outwards to be exercised also by interest groups, private business, charity, think tanks, and so on. Power is distributed into public-private partnerships, financial networks, civil regulation, and other arrangements. Thus, governance provides us with the concept that overcomes the dichotomies of state versus civil society, non-governmental versus governmental, governing versus being governed, private versus public, official versus unofficial, and formal versus informal. Therefore, I designated the Trilateral Commission a governance actor, not a non-governmental actor or governmental organization. However, further elaboration of the concept was needed. I choose to include the word informal in the concept, so now we have the concept informal governance actor. I'm sorry it gets a little bit technical here, but hang on or bear with me. In relation to the actor, the term informal means that they originate from within civil society. The informal actor enjoys a considerable degree of autonomy from the state and adopts their own rules, finances their own activities, and determines their own goals. However, although the actor may be informal, they still play a role in governance. In relation to governance, the term informal means that the actor informally participates in governance frameworks, processes, and or contributes to governance outcomes. You may ask, what is informal governance then? Well, the informality is understood as, and I quote, those non-codified settings of day-to-day interaction concerning policy issues in which the participation of actors, the formulation of coalitions, the process of agenda setting, and decision-making are not structured by a pre-given set of rules of formal institutions, unquote. Informal governance, then, is, quote, the operation of networks of individual and collective, public and private actors pursuing common goals, which leads to cooperation, patterned relations, and public decisions, through regular, though non-codified and not publicly sanctioned exchanges. This is how I arrived at the general concept informal governance actor. In a very similar process, I have reinterpreted the concept informal diplomacy, but I will not go into the details of that concept today. Together, these two concepts have served to determine and conceptualize the kind of organization that the Trilateral Commission was. But they also raised the question of how the Commission specifically participates in governance and diplomacy. This is how we arrive here today at my main result, or my main argument, if you will. The Trilateral Commission helped establish regular pattern of informal diplomatic activities between the trilateral regions. I argue that the Commission's activities in this area at some points were subordinated to and managed by governments, but that it kept a basic initiative and independence. For instance, at the peak of the oil crisis, the Commission helped reconcile the positions of the US and French governments at a summit held in Martinique in 1974. Often the Commission's informal diplomacy took the form of parallel diplomacy, complementing formal diplomatic efforts. However, the Commission also questioned and challenged formal diplomacy. This was particularly the case initially. But when it did so, the aim was always to stay close to and maintain a good working relationship with decision makers. Informal governance actors form part of a web of global governance, and the Trilateral Commission was embedded in networks, in which formal and informal actors from time to time were pursuing common goals. In the overlapping corporate and political networks that the Commission was part of, the Commission developed cooperation, patterned relations, and took part in developing policies through regular and non-codified and non-publicly sanctioned exchanges. I demonstrate that it interacted with a plethora of actors, transcending divides between the state and civil society, the national and international, and merging the formal and informal spheres. There was a high degree of mobility and accessibility in these high-level networks, and neither individuals nor ideas were fixed but circulated together with information and knowledge. Let me give you an example concerning the accessibility of commissioners to governments. The Commission enjoyed ready access to the highest level of national government, and as you have seen, commissioners were often chosen for government service, including positions as president, prime ministers, or cabinet members. The peak of this development was Carter assuming the US presidency and about 1/3 of the North American section, 23 members of the Commission, entering his government. In general, commissioners circulated in and out of government and the Commission. The circulation, however, also included ideas and policy recommendations. A commissioner might initiate the production of a report in the Commission and a few years later be seated in the government that was implementing one of its recommendations. Not only through the Commission's meetings, but also through its production of reports, which included a wide range of consultation with experts, politicians, and government members in all 3 regions, did the Commission manage to participate in shaping basic policy perceptions and concepts. My dissertation shows how the Commission contributed to generate new ideas and consolidate existing ones, how it identified problems, formulated agendas, and promoted solutions in the policy-making process. This renders obsolete the view of this process as being the work of the government alone, although it does not imply a symmetrical relationship between the formal and informal spheres in governance. The exact relationship has to be determined from case to case based on detailed historical evidence and analysis. However, my dissertation suggests that we understand policymaking in this period as a process in which problems and solutions were being identified collectively by actors from both the formal and informal sectors. That modern governance and diplomacy should be seen as a product of the merging of informal and formal spheres, with policy formulation taking place collectively in overlapping transnational elite networks. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, we had a very detailed discussion, and we found that you were good at answering the questions, and you sort of held your own place, and there's of course still some issues where we have pointed out that you could do some more or change some of the stuff, and you also acknowledged some of those. So we kind of gave you a pass, or whatever it's called. So we will recommend to the PhD school to give you the PhD degree.
Thank you.
Okay.